My name is Dorian Wilder, and I've always carried the weight of the past with me. The memories, the moments, they are all etched into me, as much a part of me as my very breath. But nothing weighs heavier than a love you can never voice, a feeling you can never share, and a friendship that demands silence. Lysander was my best friend. We grew up together, side by side, through everything. He was bold, decisive, always at the front of every adventure we had. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more introspective, but always there. I admired him, looked up to him in a way that a brother might, even though I knew deep down that we were never truly the same. But there was one thing I knew for sure, Lysander and I had a bond that nothing could ever break. And then there was Celine, Lysander's wife. I loved her, but that love was a secret I could never let slip. She was everything I couldn't have, gentle, kind, and impossibly beautiful. I kept my distance, kept my emotions locked away, because the truth was, I was never meant to be with her. Not while Lysander was around. He was my friend, and I would never betray him, even if my heart whispered otherwise. But everything changed the night Lysander was gone. It was late when I received the call. The kind of call that made everything stop. The words were clear but incomprehensible. He was in an accident. He was dead. Lysander, my closest friend, was no more. The world tilted on its axis, and I stood there, frozen in disbelief. I couldn't process it. How could someone so full of life be gone in an instant? The funeral was a blur. Faces, voices, all distant and muted. All I could focus on was the woman sitting by the grave. Celine. She was utterly still, as if the life had been drained from her along with his. I stood behind her, my heart aching with the realization that she was now alone. And yet, there was something else, something unspoken between us, a connection I couldn't ignore. I stayed away from her for a while, trying to give her space to grieve. But the truth was, I couldn't leave her alone. She needed help, and in some twisted way, I needed to be near her. The thought of her being all alone in the world, without Lysander, haunted me. And so, I began to help her, to fill the gap he left behind, to be the man I could never be while he was alive. I would check on her every day, keep her company, and try to ease the pain of her loss in whatever way I could. She was always so distant, though, her eyes haunted, as if she was carrying a burden heavier than any of us could imagine. But I didn't know it yet. I didn't know how deeply tangled her grief was in her own secrets. Every day was a new struggle. Celine was not the same woman I had known. She withdrew, her thoughts clearly far away, and it was becoming harder for me to reach her. Every time I looked at her, the same question echoed in my mind: what happened to you, Celine? I didn't know what I was expecting to find when I first started checking on her. I thought it was just about helping her through the pain, offering her a shoulder to cry on. But something inside me, something deeper, urged me to stay close. I began to notice small things, the way she would flinch when I mentioned Lysander's name, the odd, unexplained absences when she would disappear for hours without a word. She wasn't just mourning, she was hiding something. Something darker than grief. I didn't know it yet, but the truth was slipping through my fingers, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized that there was a secret buried beneath everything. I remember the first time I saw Celine's face twist in something that wasn't sorrow. It was late at night. She was in the kitchen, her hands frozen on the countertop, staring out the window. I was about to speak when she turned, her eyes colder than I had ever seen them. "Don't," she said. "Don't try to understand." There was something in the way she said it, as if she knew I was already beginning to figure it out. But how could I? I had only known Lysander's death to be an accident. I hadn't even thought to question it. I stayed with Celine and helped her as best as I could, but every day, the burden grew heavier. I began to ask myself the same questions over and over: what if there's more to this? What if his death wasn't an accident? But what could I do? I wasn't a detective. I wasn't someone who could dig into the past and uncover secrets. I was just a man trying to hold on to a friendship that had already slipped through my fingers. But deep down, I knew one thing: I couldn't stop. I couldn't walk away. Because despite everything, despite the love I had to hide, despite the guilt I felt for being so close to the woman I knew I could never have, I was drawn to her. And I didn't know it yet, but this would be the beginning of a twisted journey that would change everything I thought I knew. The weeks following Lysander's funeral were a blur of routine. Celine seemed to drift in and out of herself, her days blending into one another as she kept herself busy with trivial tasks. But no matter how many hours she spent working or the smiles she forced herself to put on when I visited, there was a hollowness about her, a void that only seemed to deepen with time. I tried not to let it consume me, but every day that passed, my thoughts grew more restless. Lysander's death had left behind more than just a mourning widow. It had left behind questions. And those questions began to gnaw at my insides. One evening, I stayed a little later than usual, sitting on the edge of the sofa in Celine's living room, my gaze falling on her from across the room. She was seated by the window, staring out into the darkened night. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. A glass of wine sat untouched beside her, as if it had been there for hours. "I'm here, you know," I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. "You don't have to pretend that everything is fine." She didn't respond immediately, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the glass before she finally turned to me. Her eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something I couldn't place, something sharp, something hidden. "I'm not pretending," she replied flatly, her voice tinged with a quiet bitterness that didn't match her usual gentle tone. "I'm just tired." I knew it wasn't just exhaustion. Something was off. I'd seen the small, almost imperceptible shifts in her behavior, the moments when she would become distant, her thoughts clearly far away. It was as though she was trapped somewhere, a place that I couldn't follow. "What's really going on, Celine?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is there something you're not telling me?" She glanced at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she would dismiss me again, but instead, she sighed heavily. "You don't understand, Dorian. You'll never understand." Her words hung in the air, cold and unyielding. I wanted to push further, but I could see that she was on the edge, as if the walls she'd so carefully constructed were beginning to crumble. I was afraid to push too hard, afraid that she might shut me out completely. So, instead, I let the silence fill the space between us. The following week, I received an unexpected call from a local mechanic, someone who had once worked with Lysander on his car. He'd been a quiet man, someone who I didn't know well, but he'd always been friendly. The message was simple: "I found something you might want to see. Come by when you can." Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to expect, but I had a gut feeling that it was connected to Lysander's death. I couldn't let it go. I had to know. When I arrived at his shop, he led me to the back, where a few old vehicles were parked under dim lights. His face was lined with anxiety as he handed me a small black box, the kind of thing you wouldn't expect to find in the hands of a mechanic. I could feel my heart beat a little faster, my fingers trembling as I accepted the box. "I don't know if it's anything important," he said, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "But you should. Take a look." I opened the box and found a small, weathered piece of paper inside, folded in half. As I unfolded it, my eyes widened at what I saw. It was a receipt, one for a car rental from the night of Lysander's accident. The name on the receipt wasn't Lysander's, though. It was Celine's. My stomach twisted in confusion. Why would she have rented a car that night? "I don't know what it means," the mechanic said, "but I thought you should have it." I stood there, frozen in disbelief. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together in a way I couldn't understand. Celine had been involved, in some way, with that night. But how? And why had she kept it a secret? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning the receipt over in my mind, wondering what it meant. Was Celine hiding something from me? Or had I simply misunderstood her? I wanted to trust her, I really did. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a feeling that I couldn't shake. The next morning, I decided to confront her. It was a risky move, but I had to know the truth. When I arrived at her house, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her hair tied back loosely, looking tired but still beautiful in her own quiet way. She looked up as I entered, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dorian," she said softly, as if sensing the change in the air. "What's wrong?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Why was your name on the rental receipt from the night of Lysander's accident?" I asked, my voice steady but heavy with suspicion. Her eyes widened, but only for a second. She quickly masked the surprise, her face turning cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." I placed the receipt on the table, watching as her gaze flickered to it. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, with a sigh, she stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the yard. "Lysander didn't tell you everything," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "There were things he kept from you. Things I thought I could keep hidden." I felt a sharp pang in my chest. "What things, Celine? What are you hiding?" Her back was still turned to me, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. "It wasn't an accident, Dorian," she said, her voice low and strained. "Lysander wasn't supposed to die. But that night everything changed. It was all part of a plan. A plan that he didn't know about." I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend the weight of her words. My hands clenched into fists as I realized that the truth was darker than I could have imagined. And Celine, the woman I had tried to protect, had a secret that could shatter everything. The truth, once spoken, could not be easily forgotten. Celine's words echoed in my head, a haunting refrain that I couldn't escape: "It wasn't an accident, Dorian." My pulse quickened, and a deep sense of betrayal washed over me as I stood frozen in the kitchen. My heart hammered in my chest, and my mind raced to piece together everything I had learned. The small, seemingly insignificant detail of the rental receipt now loomed large in my thoughts. Celine had been involved in Lysander's death in ways I had never imagined. But the question that gnawed at me was why would she keep this from me? What kind of plan had Lysander been a part of, and why had Celine kept it from me for so long? "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight pressing on my chest, each word harder to force out than the last. "Why did you keep this secret?" "I trusted you, Celine." She turned to face me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't read, a mixture of sorrow and determination, as though she had already come to terms with something I hadn't yet understood. "Because it wasn't my choice," she replied quietly. "I never wanted to lie to you, but things were complicated, Dorian. You wouldn't have believed me." I ran a hand through my hair, feeling a storm of emotions surge within me. Anger. Hurt. Confusion. "What do you mean, complicated? What was going on? What did Lysander get himself into?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Instead, she walked slowly over to the small fireplace that burned quietly in the corner of the room, staring into the flames. The room was thick with tension, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the silence. "Lysander wasn't just a businessman," she began softly, as though testing the words before committing to them. "He was mixed up with some dangerous people. People who don't just let things go." I tried to tell him to back off, but he wouldn't listen. And then she paused, her breath hitching as her voice faltered. "And then, it all went wrong." I felt the ground beneath me shift as I processed what she was saying. Dangerous people. What are you talking about? Lysander was always so careful, so meticulous. He never seemed involved in anything shady. That's what he wanted you to think, she said bitterly, finally turning to face me fully. Her eyes were red, though she wasn't crying. There was an edge of exhaustion in her expression, as though she had lived through more than she could bear. But he was involved in things I didn't know about until it was too late. People with power. People who didn't care who got hurt in the process. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. You're saying his death wasn't an accident? That someone set him up? Yes, she answered firmly. But not in the way you think. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It was orchestrated. By me. The words hit me like a slap, and I staggered back, struggling to process the gravity of what she had just admitted. What? What do you mean by that? You were involved in his death. Not directly, she whispered. But I was the reason it happened. You see, Lysander was trying to make a deal with the wrong people. They gave him an ultimatum: betray us, or they would kill him. She trembled as she spoke, but her voice remained steady. I knew what they would do to him if he didn't comply. So I made a choice. I convinced him to take the deal. But it wasn't enough. It never was. My mind was reeling. Celine had betrayed Lysander. She had played a part in the very deal that led to his death. The questions only grew more numerous, more pressing. And the car rental? The receipt? I asked, trying to make sense of it all. She didn't immediately answer, but after a long pause, she spoke again. That night, Lysander went to meet with them. He didn't tell me, but I followed him. I had to. When I got there, I saw him, and I knew. It was already too late. The deal had gone wrong, and they were going to kill him. Her voice broke, but she regained her composure. I couldn't stop it. So, I made sure that when he left, I made it look like an accident. I arranged everything, and made sure no one suspected it was anything more than a tragic event. I felt the air leave my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I had never imagined that the woman I had been so close to, the one I had trusted, could be capable of something like this. She had orchestrated her husband's death. But why? I managed to croak out. Why didn't you tell me? Why keep this a secret? Because I didn't want you to hate me, she said softly, her eyes downcast. I thought I was saving him, Dorian. I thought I was saving us. But instead, I ended up losing him. And now I've lost you, too. The words stung more than I expected. I had always known Celine was hiding something, but I had never suspected this. To know that she had been complicit in Lysander's death, it felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath my feet. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. You've taken everything from me, Celine. You've taken my best friend, and now you're taking me. She reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. She seemed to shrink into herself, the walls of guilt and regret closing in around her. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you, Dorian. I thought I was doing the right thing. But there was no undoing what had been done. I could feel it in my bones. The truth was out now, and it changed everything. Later that night, I walked aimlessly through the streets of the city, the weight of Celine's confession dragging me down like a heavy stone. My mind was a storm of confusion, grief, and betrayal. Had Lysander known what was going on? Did he have any idea that his own wife was the one who had sealed his fate? What did that mean for me now? What did it mean for Celine and me? I didn't have answers, only more questions. But one thing was painfully clear: I had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And the truth, I realized, was that I had been living in the dark for far too long. Now that the veil had lifted, there was no turning back. I couldn't sleep that night. The revelation, heavy and suffocating, had lodged itself deep in my mind, twisting with each passing hour. As the moonlight poured through the window, I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts consumed by Celine's confession. Her words, no matter how many times I tried to push them away, wouldn't leave me. She hadn't just lied to me. She hadn't just concealed a truth. She had orchestrated the death of the one person I had trusted most in this world. And I had been so blind, so willing to believe the best in everyone, even when it was clear that I should have known better. I turned over in bed, my hand brushing against the cold sheets where Lysander had once lain, a ghost of him still lingering in the room. The soft scent of his cologne mixed with the distant echoes of laughter from times when things had been simpler, before the world had shifted underfoot. But no amount of regret or self-loathing could bring him back. I knew that. Still, the overwhelming desire for justice clouded my mind. I couldn't let Celine get away with this. She had destroyed Lysander. She had manipulated everything, turned the knife of betrayal not just in his back, but in mine as well. I had to make her pay. But how? How could I bring justice to the man who had been my brother? To the woman who had been my lover? The plan started to form in my mind, each thought darker than the last. I needed to take control of the narrative. Celine had been too careful, too calculated, and now I would be the one who controlled the story. I met Celine the following morning, the weight of my decision already settling heavily upon me. I had been avoiding her calls all night, but today, I couldn't hide. I couldn't run. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, her back turned toward me, a cup of coffee in front of her. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept at all. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. I watched her, trying to find the woman I had loved so deeply. But the woman who sat before me now seemed like a stranger. Her betrayal had turned her into someone unrecognizable. "Dorian," she finally said, her voice soft, but there was no warmth in it. "We need to talk." I stepped closer, my anger rising with each breath I took. "Talk? After everything you've told me? You think we still have something to talk about?" She turned to face me, her eyes filled with both fear and sorrow. "I didn't want this, Dorian. I never wanted it to go this far. I thought I was saving him. I thought I was saving all of us." I laughed bitterly. "Save us? By killing him? By lying to me? How could you think that was the right thing to do?" She flinched, but her eyes never left mine. "I thought I was protecting you. From the truth. From the consequences. Protecting me." I took a step closer, my voice rising. "You were never protecting me, Celine. You were protecting yourself. You did it all for your own selfish reasons. For your own survival." Her face tightened, the sorrow in her eyes replaced by something more resolute. "You don't understand, Dorian. You don't know the people Lysander was involved with. You don't know what they were capable of." I crossed my arms, my fists clenched at my sides. "What, like they'd come after you? After us? If you were so scared, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" She looked away, a tear slipping down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand. You never understood. Lysander was in too deep. He couldn't get out. And neither could I." The silence between us stretched, a chasm widening with each passing moment. I wanted to scream, to tear apart everything she had said. But instead, I was quiet, letting her words sink into me, turning them over, trying to make sense of the pieces. "I need to know everything," I said finally, my voice cold and deliberate. "I need to know who else is involved. Who were you protecting him from? What kind of people are we talking about here?" Her eyes met mine again, and for the first time, there was a flicker of fear in them. "I can't tell you, Dorian. It's too dangerous. I don't care anymore, I said harshly. You've already dragged me into this. Now, you'll tell me everything. There was a long, drawn-out pause before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. It's the syndicate, Dorian. The one Lysander had been working with. They were too powerful. They gave him the option to turn on us, or, they'd kill him. He chose wrong. And I made sure it looked like an accident, like nothing more than fate. My stomach turned. The name she spoke, the syndicate, was one that I had only ever heard in whispers, in rumors, but never in direct connection to Lysander. And now, the truth was unraveling before me. How deep does it go? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. How much did you know? She shook her head, her eyes brimming with a mix of dread and regret. Too much. I wish I didn't know any of it. But it's too late now. They'll come for me, for both of us. There's nothing we can do to change that. I stood there, frozen, feeling as if the floor beneath me had been ripped away. My best friend was dead. And the woman I had loved was complicit in it all. But the fear in her voice didn't move me. It only fueled the fire in my chest. The one person I had cared about, trusted, had deceived me. The path to revenge was now clear, even if it meant bringing everything crashing down. I'll fix this, I said, my voice cold and steely. I'll make them pay for what they've done. And so, the decision was made. I didn't know how far I was willing to go or what price I would pay, but I knew one thing for certain, I wouldn't let this injustice slide. Not when everything I had was lost. I thought I had it all figured out. The truth was in my hands, and all that was left was to expose Celine for the monster she truly was. I had spent weeks unearthing her lies, connecting the dots, and finding every piece of evidence that would ensure her downfall. The pieces of Lysander's death had come together perfectly, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of the truth, of justice, within reach. I had imagined the moment where I would bring her to her knees, the moment where she would be forced to face the consequences of her manipulation, her betrayal. I had imagined it so clearly that it almost felt inevitable. But I was wrong. Celine had outplayed me. Before I could even make a move to take my findings to the authorities, Celine had already orchestrated her final act, the one that would seal my fate. It was a quiet evening when everything changed. I was at my apartment, preparing to present my case to the police, to finally make them understand that it had been Celine, not Lysander, who was responsible for his death. I gathered all the evidence, documents, testimonies, photos, and made my final preparations. My heart was pounding in my chest, filled with the anticipation of vindication. Then, just as I was about to leave, my phone rang. It was an anonymous tip. A police officer had apparently received an urgent piece of information that had led them to a new lead in the case. My instincts told me to be cautious, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the lead, walking into the darkness of the night, unaware that it was a trap set by Celine herself. The moment I walked into the police station, I was immediately surrounded by officers. The shock hit me in waves. My head spun as they placed handcuffs on me, reading me my rights with cold indifference. I tried to speak, tried to explain everything, to show them the evidence I had painstakingly gathered. But it was no use. The damning proof I had uncovered was not enough to silence Celine's twisted deception. What I hadn't known, what I never could have anticipated, was that while I had been gathering evidence to destroy her, she had been working in the shadows, planting false evidence to turn the tables on me. Celine had fabricated messages, forged documents, and even staged a scene that made it look like I had been the one who killed Lysander. She had arranged for the authorities to find supposed witnesses who would swear that they had seen me in the area on the night of his death. Her manipulation was flawless. And just like that, I became the prime suspect. The trial was swift, an agonizing blur that dragged on for weeks. Celine remained composed, playing the role of the grieving widow, the woman who had lost everything. She feigned innocence with such perfection that even the judge and jury were swayed by her act. I tried to fight back. I hired the best lawyer I could afford. I presented the truth, the real story of what had happened that night, but it didn't matter. Celine's lies had already taken root. Her carefully constructed narrative overshadowed mine. The court believed her version of events, that I had killed Lysander out of jealousy, that I had been consumed with a desire to take Celine for myself. The more I pleaded my innocence, the more the walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on me. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of Celine. I was convicted of Lysander's murder. I was sentenced to life in prison. As I sat in the cold, sterile cell, staring through the metal bars, a wave of crushing despair washed over me. The finality of it all was suffocating. I had been betrayed, not only by Celine, but by a justice system that had failed to see the truth. The walls around me were silent, unyielding. I was no longer a man of ambition, of hope, of love. I was a broken shell, condemned to spend the rest of my life behind bars for a crime I did not commit. Every inch of me was consumed by a bitter resentment, a hatred that I could not let go. I had loved Celine with everything I had. I had trusted her when no one else would. But now, I saw her for what she truly was, a master of manipulation, a woman who had used me as nothing more than a pawn in her sick, twisted game. She had taken Lysander from me, then taken my life. She had orchestrated the death of the one person I had cared about, and now, she had stolen my future as well. Celine, on the other hand, walked free. I could only imagine her, standing at the edge of a new beginning, her life untouched by the consequences of her actions. She had escaped, taking with her not only the secret of Lysander's death, but also the twisted victory of having broken me. She no longer needed to hide in the shadows, she had won. I had failed. The months passed in that suffocating prison, and with every passing day, I was haunted by the knowledge that I would never have the chance to make things right. Celine would never pay for her sins. She would continue to live her life, as if nothing had ever happened. And I would remain trapped in this endless nightmare. As I lay on the cold concrete floor of my cell, staring up at the dim light above me, the bitterness of my situation gnawed at me. I had been a fool to think that love could save me, that justice would prevail. In the end, it had been my love for Celine that had led me to this point, and it would be my hatred for her that would keep me alive, if only to remind me of how everything I had ever believed in had been destroyed by one woman's betrayal. The world outside might forget about me, but I would never forget what she had done. And if there was any justice left in this world, maybe one day, it would be her who would have to pay. But for now, all I could do was watch the shadows move across the walls of my cell, the coldness creeping deeper into my bones. And as I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Celine's voice again, echoing in the silence, "You were always too weak, Dorian. I told you."